Okay, another traditional theory in the personal identity debate is the psychological continuity theory. And John Locke is a famous proponent of this theory, and we'll discuss what it is here. So psychological continuity theory says you survive if and only if your psychology survives. You know, some proposals are your beliefs, memories, preferences, character traits, capacity for rational thought, or some combination of these. So some main proponents are John Locke and Derek Parfit. And Derek Parfit recently passed away, but he was a very, famous expositor of this theory. So you survive if your psychology survives. So long as you have this chain of, say, memories and preferences and character traits carrying along, continuing to exist, then you continue to exist, right? But if those things cease to exist, then you cease to exist. So your identity is bound up in your psychology. So what would the PCT theorist say about the various cases of amnesia, the fetus case, transplant and teletransportation cases? Now, I've given a simplified version of the theory, so, some proponents of the theory might cry foul. They say, my theory doesn't have that consequence. Well, fine, I'm just giving a simplified sort of straightforward theory, and, we can make nuances in other contexts. Okay, so in the amnesia case, that's where you lose your memories, right? John Locke, it seems, and there's some dispute about this, that he thought that you survive if and only if your memory survives. So for that interpretation of John Locke, yes, if you have amnesia, you cease to exist, right? Or you suffer from amnesia, you cease to exist. So whenever you lose your memories, you're no longer there. But for a more extreme version of amnesia where, you kind of lose your personality, you have different desires, preferences, obviously beliefs, then yeah, you cease to exist. Once that's gone, you're gone. And someone else takes your place who is in your body and has some of your characteristics. In the fetus case, if you don't have a brain as a fetus, say before 5 weeks of age, 5 weeks after conception, then obviously you don't have a psychology, and therefore you don't exist. So the PCT theorist very clearly, unless you have a very different take on the psychological continuity theory, you have a different sort of nuanced theory, they would say that you never existed as an early fetus. You came to exist when your psychology developed to some extent. The transplant case where your brain is moved to a different body, presumably when your brain is moved, your personality and beliefs and etc. are moved. So on PCT theory, you go wherever your brain goes, right? What about teletransportation? So your body is destroyed and recreated at another site. Now, if there doesn't have to be a physical continuity, right? Because here there's a break, your body is destroyed, it doesn't exist. A new body out of new materials is created. That thing has your personality. So if there doesn't have to be a physical continuity between one thing and another, then it seems like you continue to exist and you're teletransported. So all you need to do is have some body on the other side at the target site with your personality, memories, etc. And that's all it takes for you to be at that target site. So you would survive teletransportation. Okay, so to give an argument against PCT, psychological continuity theory, I have to, give you some a principle and an argument form. The principle is the transitivity of identity. The argument form is reductio ad absurdum. You can't understand the argument unless you understand these two things. So the transitivity of identity says if A is numerically identical to B and B is numerically identical to C, then A is numerically identical to C. All right, so suppose you are numerically identical to Jenny. Suppose further that you are identical to Sarah, then Jenny is numerically identical to Sarah. So you are A, Sarah is B. No, let's see. You are A, Jenny is B, Sarah is C, right? So then, in fact, you're not three people, you're just one. These names are just different ways of referring to the same person. So this is a straightforward, nearly self-evident truth, it seems. If A equals B and B equals C, then A equals C. And yeah, so the argument does rely on it, but it's pretty non-controversial. Then reductio ad absurdum. The argument form is reductio ad absurdum. So what is that? With a reductio ad absurdum, basically, you prove that a certain statement S is true, so S stands for a statement, by showing that its negation, not S, leads to a contradiction. All right, well, let's give an example. Some statement S would be, the sky is blue, and then its negation, not S, would be not the case that the sky is blue. All right, so if you want to prove that the sky is blue using reductio ad absurdum, you start out by assuming that the sky is not blue and show that the assumption that the sky is not blue leads to a contradiction. Okay, so how does this work? Well, if a statement S is false, then its negation, not S, is true, and vice versa. If a statement S is true, its negation is false, right? So since contradictions can't be true, any statement that entails a contradiction also can't be true. So if not S leads to a contradiction, then we know that S is true. Right, here's the form. If you want to prove that S is true, you assume not S. You show that not S leads to a contradiction, and then you can infer S. So you have here, not S is the assumption, then various premises here leading to premise N, which just stands for, some numbered premise. Could be 8, could be 4, could be 3, it really doesn't matter. You can show that P is true, but then you can also show that through various implications, not P is true, and it all follows from not S. Therefore, S is true. Since not S leads to a contradiction, P and not P, S is true. All right, so you want to prove that S is true. You start by assuming that S is not true. You show that the negation of S leads to a contradiction, and therefore you can infer that S is true, and you've proved that S is true. So here's the duplication argument, and this might help you understand what reductio ad absurdum looks like, right? So here's our assumption for reductio, that the psychological continuity theory is true. Why are we assuming it's true? Well, because we want to prove that psychological continuity theory leads to a contradiction, and therefore that it's false, because contradictions can't be true, neither can anything that leads to a contradiction. Okay. Premise 2, if psychological continuity theory is true, then if God creates a psychological duplicate of you, that person is you. And you could call this duplicate Jenny. So suppose that, I exist and God creates a psychological duplicate of me. Well, that person that is a psychological duplicate of me actually is me, because whoever has my psychology is me. But then suppose God decides to get funny and he creates another psychological duplicate of you. That person is also you. So we'll call this person Sarah. Jenny is identical to you, or me, whomever we have in mind. Let's say you. Jenny is identical to you. Sarah is identical to you. This follows from the theory itself, because any anything that has your psychology is you. 4, since both Jenny and Sarah are numerically identical to you, they are numerically identical with each other, which follows from the transitivity of identity, right? So you are identical to Jenny, you are identical to Sarah, therefore Jenny is identical to Sarah, right? But obviously, Jenny and Sarah are not numerically identical to each other since they are two different people. Yes, they have the same psychology, but one's over here, one's over there, right? And their futures will diverge at any rate. So if that's right, if number 5 is right that they're numerically different people, then you have a contradiction between 4 and 5. Okay? 4 says they are identical, 5 says they're not. And so therefore, since we assumed that psychological continuity theory is true, and it led to a contradiction, namely a contradiction between 4 and 5, we can infer that psychological continuity theory is not true. Because any theory or statement that leads to a contradiction is false. How might the PCT theorist respond? Not PCTS, PCT theorist. Number 1, they might deny the transitivity of identity. But this seems self-evidently true, the transitivity of identity. A equals B, B equals C, therefore A equals C. So it seems like we should be more confident that the transitivity of identity is true than that psychological continuity theory is true. 2, you might deny that it's possible for God to create duplicates. But why should this be the case? I mean, we're not even assuming God exists, right? We're just saying suppose God exists. And suppose God's all-powerful. Like, why can't an all-powerful being make a psychological duplicate of you? I've seen the movie Multiplicity, right? With Multiplicity, there's this machine that's creating duplicates of the main character. I can't think of his name right now, but of the main character. I mean, if a machine can do it, certainly God can. I mean, if it's conceivable that a machine could, God can. So, I mean, it doesn't even matter that we refer to God. We could just refer to a machine, right? So why couldn't God or some machine create a psychological duplicate of you? Maybe even we can do it in the future if we develop our technology enough. So 1 and 2 seem like dead ends. I mean, I'd rather believe that we could create a duplicate of us than to believe in psychological continuity theory. The one seems more true than the other, or more likely to be true. And I mean, I don't see why I should deny the transitivity of identity. So what recourse does the psychological continuity theorist have? Here's one common sort of response that they take to the argument. So they want to revise the psychological continuity theory. So it's basically the same, except you add clause 2 that there are no psychological duplicates of you. So you survive if and only if your psychology survives, and that there don't exist any psychological duplicates of you. So that makes sense. So in this case where God creates a bunch of duplicates, well, then you don't survive, right? So whenever God creates a duplicate, you cease to exist. But that seems kind of odd to me, right? I mean, I guess I think this argument is kind of strong, but I mean, you can make up your own mind. So it seems kind of odd to me that just because some duplicate of you comes into existence, that you cease to exist, right? Something totally outside of you, causally independent of you, comes to exist in, say, Taiwan. Now you cease to exist in Nevada, right? I mean, you better watch out. Maybe God's already made a duplicate of you in Taiwan, and you don't exist, and you just don't know it yet, right? So it starts to seem absurd to me. And it's often been accused of being ad hoc, meaning that clause 2, it seems like clause 2 is just added in order to save the theory from this attack, rather than being sort of motivated by the theory itself. All right, so I mean, I'm not saying psychological continuity theory is false. I mean, you make up your own mind, but that argument seems to me pretty good. And if you can think of another response that the psychological continuity theorist might take, by all means, let me know about that, and we can have a discussion. So is psychological continuity theory consistent with life after death? What do you think? I would say pretty clearly yes, right? Especially if there doesn't have to be any sort of physical continuity between you and your future self, just a psychological continuity. So, consider this. One day you're going to die, and then suppose there's a God in a heaven, and, God, so to speak, resurrects you by creating a new body for you and placing your psychology in that body. Okay? So, in that case, your psychology survives, right? Although there's a gap in your existence, from whenever you die to when God sort of raises you from the dead, there's a gap in your existence, but your psychology does survive. At point A, it's there, and at point B, it's there. So pretty clearly, unless you think there can't be gaps in your existence, it seems like you can survive your death on psychological continuity theory. All right, next we will discuss bodily continuity theory.